Yeah, so first of all, I would like to thank the organizers for putting together such a great conference and also to putting our paper on the program. The paper I would like to present today is joint work with Clemens, Graf, Humann, Carmen, Reinhart, and Christoph Trebesch, and it is on 200 years of creditor losses. So why should we care? We probably all know that measuring creditor losses via haircuts can serve as a measure to approximate the severity of sovereign debt crisis, and by doing so, basically moving beyond a binary approach of sovereign debt crisis. So I think this is very much acknowledged or increasingly acknowledged in the literature. What we want to add to this kind of perspective, besides measuring the severity of the debt crisis via creditor losses, is what we think a perspective that is not also neglected in the literature by looking at the repeated gain aspect in sovereign debt negotiation, which is pointed out by Bulo and Roger. This refers often that it takes actually multiple restructurings to put countries on a sustainable debt path after to put countries on a sustainable debt path. That means for a debt path, until now haircuts are mainly calculated for a single debt exchange, and what we do here in this paper is also to count for this kind of, like, as I said, repeated gain aspect in sovereign debt negotiations, mainly for serial restructurings, by introducing a new measure, which we call the Bulo cumulative haircut. And this measure is supposed to measure creditor losses when there are more than one restructuring during a default spell. Maybe a brief disclaimer. So I will mainly focus only on this new kind of new measure and the stylized effects that evolves around it due to this kind of measure, due to the time restrictions this kind of presentation has. However, in this paper, we also basically work out a lot of like other stylized effects around drivers of precise haircuts. So if you're interested, then please have a look into the paper. So maybe just to setting the ground and to introduce it to the main notions we use to differentiate between final, serial, and restructurings and default spells. What I just said, mostly what is considered, there's a default, then there's a restructuring. That's basically how we mainly would consider at the end of the default. But what we do is that we actually summarize all restructurings that reside or where we find in the next 2 years after the restructuring another default. That means the entire period we call default spell, which can entail multiple restructurings under the final restructuring. And the final restructuring is defined as the restructuring that allows the country to be again on a sustainable debt path in terms of that there is no default after the 2 years of the final restructurings. And everything else would be then would count as interims or serial restructurings. Okay. So yeah, to compute haircut, we follow the classic net present value approach in the literature, which basically compares the present value of the new debt by the present value of the old debt. We use as discount rate. We use exit yields, which are which refers mainly to secondary market prices. What we do then to account for these kind of serial restructurings, we basically compute the effective, or we call it Bulo and Rogoff haircut, the effective haircut across different kinds of restructurings. Basically, this this term sums up across all restructuring events. And yeah, this would be like the single restructuring of the single haircut, and we relate it to the debt affected to the total debt stock. Debt stock we use mainly, given that it's a bit tricky to actually measure the total debt stock, we approximate the debt stock by external debt, or also because we mainly we focus on external debt and external defaults. Yeah, and this would give you like the effective haircut for one restructuring, which is then accumulated across all interim or serial restructurings until we get the final restructuring. So basically, what it tells us is what were the creditor losses, for instance, for Brazil for the 1983 to 1994 crisis, which involves 6 individual restructurings as summarized in this kind of formula. Okay, the stylized facts I would like to present today based on these kind of like cumulative blue and Robo haircut are 4. The first one is as you may already know, there's a lot of like heterogeneity in haircut size. This is true for the entire time period, so across 200 years. Then we also find that default is partial, so they are rarely write-off, meaning that they are like 100% haircuts. We find a median haircut of a Bulu median haircut of 40%. What we also find is that period restructurings within the default are very common and on the rise, especially from the 1970s onwards. And we also find that these kind of like interim restructurings that I just showed you in the graph, that these show often smaller haircuts than actually the final haircut. Okay, then let's move on to the first stylized fact. Yeah, what you here see is basically all individual haircuts across 200 years, and you see there's a lot of variation. The haircuts are showing like 100% write-off or like 100% write-off of claims. It's mainly due to geopolitical events or revolutions. Revolutions where new governments in charge basically claim the eligibility of the debt of the previous government that they raised. We have also some restructurings that show negative haircuts. This is mainly due to the fact that countries maybe accept, for instance, longer maturity extensions, which then results with the restrictive exit yield into a negative haircut. Right. Yeah, and all right, okay. So the next, what you see here is on the left-hand side, you see the duration of each default spell, right? So this is basically, again, as I said, the default time until when the country enters again its sustainable debt path. What you see here is that we see a very prolonged default spells before the 1870s, which then steadily decreases until nowadays. At the same time, while we have these kind of like long default spells, we see that now there's this kind of thing about what you see. Okay, what you see here is basically that you have an increase. That you have an increase of number of restructurings per default spell, and nowadays that on average every default spells show 1.6 number of restructurings on average. So that means that countries need most times nowadays 2 restructurings until they gain their sustainability again. The last slide aspect is, you see here, is that we differentiate again between the final and the interim restructurings. And what you see here is that the final restructurings are very equally distributed, with the median roughly 50%, whereas the interim restructuring show much a distribution which is much, or most of the haircut size is much lower than 40%, and the median haircut is around 30%, which is also basically reinstated by this kind of figure, where you see that the more restructurings a country enters, the higher than the cumulative haircut. Like, for instance, if you have only one restructuring, you end up with like a 40% haircut. Whereas if you have already, if you need already 3 restructurings per default spread, then you have already a 60% haircut on average. Yeah, to wrap up, what we did here is that in comparison to previous research that focused often on individual debt restructurings, we consider basically the entire crisis period, or also called the default spread, by calculating cumulative creditor losses. And and we named it after the paper I just mentioned in the introduction, the Bodo-Rogoff haircut, so that we can actually consider the entire default spread. And maybe one takeaway, and what might be probably also subject to discussion, is that determining the right haircut size and the right timing, or basically the results suggest that this is of great importance to limit overall creditor losses and to keep the default period of debtor states of debtor countries relatively short. All right, thank you.
So we have some time for questions. Yeah.
Thanks very much. This is very interesting. Matthias Baumann is my name. I was wondering, so how you define the final restructuring, or just by saying that there's no subsequent restructuring or the default within the 2 consecutive years.
Exactly.
Like off the top of my head, I could probably figure out a number of cases where there were 2 years without default, but then the next default or next restructuring occurred 4 or 5 years later. So isn't that potentially a problem? And isn't it even worse?
I mean, of course, it could, admittedly, this like 2-year limit might be a little bit arbitrary, but I think we also checked like for also like 3 years, like it's 3 years default free time window, and I think the results does not change so much. So much, and maybe also to say that, I mean, I think like within like 4 or 5 years there could also happen again new things, right? Maybe there has been like a new output contraction or things like this, which is not so much contingent on the past. With a question. Sorry.
Thank you. I understand from your presentation that if you wait longer, you get a better haircut from 40 to 60%. So is it in the interest of the debtor to wait?
I think it's a bit okay. Yeah, it's a bit
the opposite.
I mean, it's a bit tricky to basically predict this ex ante, right? Because what we show is basically the realized haircuts, and I mean, I think everyone would probably expect that like the first restructuring will be also the last one. And what we just chose that there might be some kind of like maybe mismeasurement or some kind of like some kind of like underestimation of the real debt relief that is due to the haircut, which then maybe leads to the next default within the 2 years and to these kind of like cumulative haircut. But yeah, I wouldn't say per se that the strategy should be to wait.
This is what we can understand from your presentation.
Sorry?
This is what we can understand from your presentation.
Yeah, but as I said, I mean, I just try to nuance it a little bit and to say that there might be also other factors which needs to be taken into consideration, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, just continuing on
Yeah.
what Marc is saying. It'd be fascinating to use a valuation to try to understand why we have this similarity. It could be like an option, you know, in case things turn out better, to have the option of keeping less debt reduction, or it could be, you know, the fear of losing, conservatism of the institutions. Could be various things, but probably can be tested. For example, can you test whether when there is a second one, it's kind of the worst case of nature, you know, in terms of trade or something,
Yeah,
or not?
that's a good remark. I mean, we haven't checked for this one, but we definitely continue, yeah. To check how far, whether like also the economic situation deteriorate.
Right.
Yeah, the longer the default credit. But I mean, in the end, if you take like for instance the 1980s, which also are termed somehow as a lost decade, where you actually have all these kind of serious structurings, or a lot of these kind of serious structurings, right? I don't know, Poland that have like 60 serious structurings, also Brazil, that basically takes wait for 10 years actually to get these countries again to a sustainable debt level. I would assume that this also makes something with your economy and also has some kind of adverse effect on the economy, right? Also given that this kind of debt crisis is termed as a lost decade for those countries.
And therefore, the question of why is important,
Yeah.
given that it's bad. Because
So I think. Should I answer? Yeah. Okay. So I think so we. Basically, so it's in our box EU column of ours, where we try to elaborate a little bit also on the reasons for this kind of like projected default rates. And I think we basically, besides probably that no one maybe likes to take losses, that might be one reason why maybe the haircuts are very small in the beginning. There might be also what we find is that there are also like a lot of like in those countries a lot of political disturbances or that then again leads to a new default, or that there is some kind of like over optimistic outlook of the economic performance of those countries. Yeah, I think that's one of like these kind of reasons.
Yes.
Yes.
It's very interesting. I guess you're talking about private restructurings, like what
Yes.
price rate.
Yeah.
Can you tell us just briefly a little bit more about typically what are the instruments and who are the creditor groups? And also, like, does this analysis have some implications for the calculations of returns in your QJE paper and like sovereign bond returns for those that are subject to those restructuring?
So we basically use external debt instruments. You can think of like bonds or loans held by, I don't know, bondholders or also banks, right? But mainly foreign bondholders or foreign banks. We cover like in the pre-1970s, we mainly cover bonds, hard currency bonds in US dollar and British pound bonds traded in New York and the London Stock Exchange. We then switched to syndicated bank loans, given that basically the sovereign bond market dries out after World War II, or dried out after World War II. And then from the 1990s onwards, we mainly use emerging market bonds emerging market bonds and the defaults of these kind of bonds. Right, and I mean, what we do in the QJE paper is that we aim for to account actually for these defaults, right? So that we adjust, for instance, coupon payments. according to the default.
If there is sequential restructuring of a given bond or the exchange bond, do you take a stance on, well, I took the losses and I'm out and I'm no longer there, second restructuring?
I mean, most of these restructurings nowadays, they are mainly bond exchanges, right? So that is basically the bond keys. And back in history, there have been like also bond exchanges that would be following similar logic, right? So that's the bond just exist and like a new bond or basically replace the old one. And of course, if there are just, for instance, like maturity extensions and maybe a coupon reduction, and the bond just exists furthermore, then we would try to of course to account for this kind of like coupon reduction due to the default.
Okay, very last question, very short answers, please.
Yes.
Very quickly. Thank you for the presentation. Going back to the serial nature of defaults, I wonder if there is a political explanation to your story. Very basically, it could be that once you defaulted once, you're less afraid to default twice. Maybe you have the logic of disinhibition in a way, I don't know, it's just a suggestion.
Okay.
Do you agree? And if this is an argument, a possible argument, how do you measure it? It's a question.
Yeah, you probably, I mean, this goes a little bit in this kind of direction, right? Whether countries are willing to not repay or whether they are not able to repay, right? And I think this is basically, a very, very much discussed question, without a definitive concrete answer on this one, right? I mean, there might, of course, you can of course try to check for performance, right? So for instance, for the liquidity of the bond, for how far there might be in market access, for like also like these kind of like debt service capacities, things like these, maybe you can check for, and put it somehow in relation to what actually the actual debt burden might be, and do some kind of these kind of like cost benefits or trade-off analysis on this one. But but in the end, that's probably a way how to measure or approach it. But,
Thank you very much. Also.
Right, so thank you very much for coming. Thank you to the organizers for having me. Glad to see more and more history in this conference. I'm just going to tell stories, just a few anecdotes, which I hope will be interesting. So this is the typical early modern profile of the government's budget constraint. And the main point here is that the red line is the spending, and what it looks like over the span of 100 years is, it's flat, and then there's these big shocks, and you get these big shocks at regular intervals, and they're really huge. These are wars, obviously. Civil spending isn't doing very much. This is England, by the way. I should mention. And the revenues just keep rising over time. They're relatively smooth, but they have to step up over time to keep up with the debt service, because these gaps obviously are financed by debt. Very quickly, it's a government typically wants to smooth the profile of taxes over time, and so when you're facing these big shocks, you need to borrow. To borrow, you're making a promise to repay, and it's got to be credible, and it's still a bit of a puzzle. Why do sovereigns actually repay, as everyone was here? The second point is flexibility can be useful. And there was a session on state contingent debt. State contingent debt, maybe not in the form that economic theory would prescribe, but at least some forms of state contingency did exist. And that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to give you two examples of the use of state contingent debts. The state contingent debt in question are these redeemable perpetual annuities, which were actually quite standard in early modern, at least in France, in Spain, in Italy, eventually in Britain. And the idea is the borrower receives a sum, say, of 100 at T=0 and promises an annuity forever. But the trick is the borrower cannot be compelled to repay, but the borrower can always extinguish the debt by returning the initial capital. So that's the meaning of face value here is the amount that the government can give to the lender, and they'll extinguish the debt, and the lender is forced to accept it. So it's basically a perpetual annuity, but there's a call option embedded in it that belongs to the government. The government can exercise it at any time, so it's an American option with an infinite life. Between private parties, this was actually quite standard in the Middle Ages, although usually it was collateralized. You buy a house or a field or something. And then governments started using it at least since the 16th century. And I need to check on what states were doing even before that. Exercising the option is not a default. There's some published papers out there that seem to think so, but that's completely wrong. However, only cash can be tendered. So if you want to do something else than cash, it's got to be voluntary on the part of the lender. So either you tender cash or you negotiate with the lender saying, let's get a deal, what's going to happen. Why don't we voluntarily accept a reduction in interest rates? This from the outside, if you don't know the details, might look like a forced haircut, but it's not. However, if you don't have cash on hand, you're not going to be able to get this reduction because the lender will say, I don't care, show me the cash. So you need to raise lots of cash, and until capital markets were deep enough or credibility was high enough, that was kind of difficult to achieve. So there was a lot of experimentation in raising the cash and coming up with intermediation structures. And the two examples I'll give are Naples in the 16th century and Britain in the 18th century. Very quickly, Naples, all you need to know is it belongs to the Spanish crown, so the King of Spain is King of Naples in this period. But it's kind of a semi-autonomous government. There's a viceroy who's sent there, and he has to govern with the local officials. And most importantly, the debt in Naples is Neapolitan debt. So if Philip II defaults on his debt in Spain, that's got nothing to do with Naples. So these are separate things. The financial structure in Naples, there's direct taxes, which are lump sum payments per household. They were granted forever, so that's a certain stream that the government can mortgage. The indirect taxes, those are farmed out on relatively short contracts, so that's not the contracts are too short to issue a perpetual debt on them. Then there's another source of income that's way too variable. So the standard debt instrument was to sell claims on these direct tax payments. Initially, they were just straight perpetual annuities. And then from the 1540s, they included the call option, which had this fun Latin name. It's a clause of retrocession at any point in time. That's literally what it says. So that's the profile for Naples, the same as I showed for Britain. The data is not as good, but you kind of see the same pattern of big spikes that are due to wars, or more often it's the King of Spain drawing money on Naples to finance his wars up in Flanders or wherever. This is the flow of borrowing over time, and this is the average rate at which it occurs. And the interesting point here is that it's going down over time. You might be surprised if you think of Philip II as the borrower from hell, but actually, at least in Naples, interest rates fell over time. So it was worth taking advantage of that option. And here's the realized outcome. In various years, I'm plotting at each year. This is the total debt service by the Neapolitan crown, and the color indicates the interest rate at which it is. The blue, it goes from blue is very high, and yellow is very low, and you can see over time that the distribution of interest payments is shifting. They're starting with very high interest debt, and then over time, it's becoming lower interest. That was a nasty default. That was a haircut. So that part was not voluntary. But all these shifts over here were voluntary. So exercising the option. But as I said, you need a lot of cash. So that's where banks came in, or bankers. And the typical deal was the bankers would provide the cash, they would carry out the redemption, calling on the debt holders and so forth, and they would get a portion of the interest savings for a certain number of years after that. That's how it worked. Of course, the banker's problem was to find the cash and also use it as sparingly as possible. So use enough money to threaten the bondholders into accepting a voluntary reduction, and then, if possible, repeat that. Either they had their own funds from deposits or short-term loans, or they lined up interested investors who were willing to buy back the debt. And one of the things that was potentially interesting was either sticky deposits, like judiciary deposits, if they could get their hands on them, or set up a banking monopoly to mobilize funds. So I'm just listing here a few examples of the very interesting, somewhat complex arrangements. 1575, there was a default in Spain. The king proposed to repay his creditors with long-term bonds in Spain. One of them said, why don't you give me long-term bonds in Naples? And you can finance the interest on those from the reduction in savings that I will engineer by using some cash. That didn't quite happen, but in 1580, there was an attempt at creating a banking monopoly in Naples. The bankers would get a monopoly for a certain number of years, and in exchange, they promised to carry out the conversion and the reduction in interest rates. And then in 1596, there's another beautiful example. King of Spain needs to send cash, see as silver that's coming from America. He wants to send it to Flanders. There's a Genoese banker who says, give me the cash, give me the silver, I'll take it to Naples, use it to do a debt conversion, I'll get some profits out of it, and I'll arrange to send you the silver all the way in Flanders. So just a few examples. And then the second example is Britain. Britain is an interesting case because it was a latecomer to the sovereign debt game. Basically in 1688, the Glorious Revolution, it has no national debt. And then it goes in space of 30 years, it accumulates a huge debt, as had done others. After the wars are over, everybody facing the same problem. They want to restructure, if you want. Some, others did it various ways. The government had been issuing two types of debt. Some of it was irredeemable. It was just a louis forever with no call option. And then another type was with the call option. And from 1717 to 1723, the government's objective was to do two things. So here's the stock by 1717. It's about a third irredeemables. 40% is redeemable, but owned by the Bank of England, the East India Company, the South Sea Company, and then 26% is owned by the public. And the name of the game, that the policy that the government chooses, is to do two things: exercise the option if it's in the money on the redeemables, and convert the irredeemables into redeemables, because they want those they want to buy the option on that debt. Of course, since they're irredeemable, to do it legally, you can only do it on the basis of a voluntary exchange. Yeah, I'm going to skip that. Anyway, we face the same problem, lots of cash. It's a huge debt, 65% of GDP. It's like you need almost the whole money stock to exercise it. So they tried to get the money companies to come up with the cash, and they played one of them against the other, Bank of England against South Sea Company, to extract loans from them. And one of the things that the companies bargained for is for the portion of the debt that the companies own, to extend, to have a protection from redemption, from exercising that option for a certain number of years, which increases the value of their debt. It's kind of strange. I don't understand really why they wanted to convert the irredeemables, because it's reprofiling, to use a word I learned yesterday. But it's the calculations that were shown in Parliament by the government proposed savings. They said, oh, look, we're going to pay less on that debt. But it's only savings in the first year. They're going to have higher payments in the future. The whole flow has to be the same in net present value. One argument is that they wanted to shift the burden of the wars, which were forever or 99 years, shifted onto the current generation. So maybe there's an intergenerational consideration. Or else they knew that the call option was valuable and they wanted to acquire it, but I don't know, maybe that was too complicated to explain to Parliament, so they didn't talk about it. They understood options, they had options, and put options. And so that's where we get into the South Sea bubble. All the South Sea bubble is really an attempt at restructuring that goes awry. Essentially, a South Sea company discovers that there's a premium on the value of its stock over and above the value of the debt that it owns, debt to the government. And so they say, let's split the premium, let's split the surplus. This is my last slide. That split the surplus between the government and the company and induce bondholders to exchange their debt into South Sea shares. And the plan works too well because that premium rises astronomically. That's the South Sea bubble. So bondholders are induced to turn in their debt at a lower price than they should have. And then when the prices fall, of course, they're very upset and disappointed. But the South Sea company had promised the government some money, part of that premium, in order to be able to carry out this exercise. So after the collapse, out of a debt of 37 million, the South Sea company has promised 7 million, which from the government's point, it's like a great deal. It's like a voluntary haircut. So they could say, no, we didn't default. This was all, contracts. You're tied to the contract. Eventually, largely for political reasons, that payment was partially and then fully remitted. So it ended up there was no actual default, although it came very close to it. What they did get out of it is all redeemable debt, but very, very different treatment of different investors. So to conclude, that call option was a very important feature of government debt. Exercising it required these innovations in banking and financing. The South Sea company was a dangerous, it turned out, innovation. But after that, redeemable perpetuals became the mainstay of government finance, both in France and in Britain. And then the rest of the 18th and 19th century show a bunch of successful conversions. First one in the mid-18th century, and many in the 19th century, which, as I said, have been mislabeled in some parts of the literature as false. But once capital markets were deep enough, financial intermediation was not necessary. That's it. Thank you. Sorry for going so fast.
More questions? Do you have a feeling why sovereigns cease to issue consols, given how valuable an option can be to?
No, I don't know. I mean, it's happened in the 20th century that things died out. Maybe the people didn't want them because trusting a perpetual in the face of inflation. These are days when, 16th century, there is the so-called price revolution, but we're talking 1% a year. I mean, not rampant inflation. 20th century, all this debt is nominal, and we know what happens with inflation. So that might be a little, but no, I don't.
Question there. How did one possible question about that is like inflation and then the possibility of debt dilution when you have the long, the console, new debt and the old one. Did it have provisions or some way of preventing the debt dilution?
It did, but it disappeared. So in 16th century Naples, your debt is actually a claim on a specific tax stream. In fact, on a specific tax collector in Calabria. And you're going to go and collect your interest in Calabria. So, and that was also when Britain starts in the late 17th, early 18th century, each bond issue is backed by a specific tax. We want to issue a 32-year bond. We create a tax on candles for 32 years, and the revenues from that is going to back the bond. So that existed, and then it disappears. In fact, the consolidated, consols comes from consolidated. It's when they put everything all together in one fund. So those protections disappeared.
And maybe that's related to the disappearance of the console.
Well, because that happens in the mid-18th century, and Britain keeps using it until World War I. And France, the same thing. They use consols a lot. Oh no, I mean, the answer to the fear of dilution is you have to credibly raise taxes.
I wanted to ask the opposite of the first question. Why did they start issuing the perpetuals? And kind of make it into a statement question is, now countries can pick up the phone and issue a bond in 10 minutes or an hour. And you said when capital markets got deep enough, then in a sense, they stopped issuing consoles. Is it maybe the case?
No. When capital markets got deep enough, they could carry out these reductions in interest rates much more easily.
Yeah.
They could exercise the option more easily. I'm not saying they, on the contrary, they kept, again, French debt in 1914, 80% of it is consols. British debt, I forget the number, but it's like 90%.
So then it disappears over time.
In the 20th
But
century.
it must have been very hard to issue a bond in 1640. So why would a city-state issue a 3-year bond to just have to refinance it in 3 years? So is it just pragmatic to issue a perpetual and secure against something? Were there experiences with issuing shorter bonds and they say, no, let's make them perpetual? So do you have any prehistory of the first issuances of perpetual bonds?
The short answer is no. I mean, all I know is that in medieval times, it was a very standard instrument. So legally, governments could just pick it off the shelf and use it to issue debt. Why not shorter term bonds? I don't know. A good question. But you do what you see. Okay, let's put it that way. What you see is there's short term debt, which is usually just a few months or a few years at most. That's negotiated with bankers, and long term debt is sold to the public to be really very schematic.
Last question.
Last quick one. Yeah. When you're collecting all this historical data, I don't suppose you came across anything on creditor composition.
I do the best I can. I have some information on Naples, for example. Yes.
Not in Britain, though.
It's a little harder for Britain because the South Sea Company registers were disposed of in the 19th century, and that was the largest chunk of government debt for a good part of the 18th century. So we don't have those. For the other debts, we do potentially. I mean, there's reams and reams of these registers in the basement of the Bank of England. All this debt was registered debt. It was all an entry on a ledger. That's what it was. So in principle, now you only have, Mr. John Watson in London. And that is, it's a bit more difficult. Naples, I know. I mean, I have some information. It's a much smaller set of people. Of course, there's fewer rich people. So it tends to be initially the nobility and then becomes more and more the commercial bourgeoisie or state officials who have money. And then the Genoese start investing quite a lot in Naples to their ultimate regret.
Well, thank you very much.
It's nice. Okay. Okay, so delighted to be here. Also friends in this room. So what I'm going to tell you today is a bit of archaeology of modern sovereign debt restructuring knowledge, and that's going to take us in a sort of very unlikely place, which is why initially the organizer were persuaded by the relevance of including this paper. So I'm going to redeem myself and tell you why it's important. So the bottom line is in the 19th century, starting in 1827, and people who are familiar with my work know what I'm going to say, there is a sovereign debt jurisdiction that is started by the London Stock Exchange, which enables country to get properly discharged. So you can get a debt write-off, a clean debt write-off that's recognized by creditors and achieve a number of very powerful things. And so that's not something that is known, and I need to write more about that so that people understand how this works. But as I was trying to do this, I stumbled on a difficulty, which is that To do that, you have to work basically with the docket of the London Stock Exchange Committee, and that's a lot of work. But even if you do that lot of work, you have difficulties because people seem to be referring to debt restructuring knowledge that is tacit. So you may wonder, where is this knowledge coming from? Like, is it intuitive from them? I mean, I have a sense from, having participated to this conference for many years, none of that is right, just intuitive. So how do they have understanding and share understanding about how a proper discharge should be worked out? And the answer I'm giving you is that, well, it's kind of, as always in history, it's kind of right under your nose. The people who pioneered this jurisdiction in 1827 have actually developed a sort of predecessor of that instrument to discharge themselves. Those stockbrokers who operate the stock exchange, okay, had developed a native instrument to deal with their own default. Okay. Now the question is why, and this is where things get really interesting. So the reason why they do that is that the bulk of the activity in the London Stock Exchange is under English statutory law. That's the Act of Barnard of 1733 is illegal, which means many things. One is that contracts are not enforceable. Okay, so you can't go to a court and enforce a stock exchange contract, which is going to be typically contract for the end of the month or a longer maturity, and which is illegal. Okay, so we have to find a way to solve that, and so this is something that is well known. So we have a whole literature that has tried to understand how this was sorted. But the one thing that people have not pondered actually is that there's a major problem that this creates for people, which is that the defaulters, who are nicknamed lame ducks, that's the origin of the modern term lame duck, are actually non-dischargeable. They can't go to a court. They can't go to a court of bankruptcy and sort their problem. So in other words, if you look at the London Gazette in the 19th century, where stockbrokers who are perfectly eligible formally to go to court if they fail, you will never find their name. You literally find just a couple of instances. So distress cannot be dealt with in the London Stock Exchange. So this is literally when Britain is increasing its borrowing. We're discussing console, etc. a minute ago. As if you measure that as a size of as a share of GDP, to because of the French wars, the Napoleonic Wars, to something like 200% of GDP. And they do that without an instrument, or at least an ostensible instrument, to discharge the stockbrokers. Well, not exactly. So this is where the story gets really interesting, because it becomes a story of common law. So what they're going to be doing, so I give you kind of the end of the story to begin with. What they're going to be doing in 1801 is that they're going to create a common law voluntary association. And under that common law voluntary association, people will adhere. So the basis of that association, of that club, so to speak, so it's like a club, is that you agree to certain rules of discharge. Okay, so you're going to be agreeing to certain rules of discharge. And what is remarkable when you look carefully at that, and I can give a little more detail during the Q&A, is that there is a categoric right for any member stockbroker to be discharged. So in other words, you fail, you sit with your creditors, they look at your books. If you're insolvent, like pure insolvent, they say, okay, 100% write-off, see you tomorrow in the market. And that's what happens, okay? So it's literally an insurance mechanism where losses are transferred from one defaulter to his creditors. Of course, if they look at your books and they find you're rich and successful, they'll ask you, to do a little bit more. But again, the important element here is that you enter into that club with a radical right to be fully discharged if there's an accident. Now, this went through stages, and rather than creating that from scratch, in part because they were going to restructure contracts that were illegal. So, under clubs and the voluntary association, you can do a lot of things in common law, but that was a bit borderline. So what they do is that they try, they do basically a trial by jury. And so in 1798, they create a sort of self-standing tribunal, okay, that is there. And you can go there and actually approach that tribunal and discharge the debt with the help of that tribunal. It doesn't have a strong coercive power, it can't do much to people, but it becomes immediately very successful. And I think it's because it's so valuable as a coordination point that they are providing to people. So what I don't observe in the data is the number of people who wouldn't go there during the first 3 years of functioning. But from the docket, I can see that they're starting to put together this kind of knowledge. And one very important point I want to emphasize is the importance of equitable treatment of creditors. It seems from the evidence that one of the major reasons why this tribunal is successful is that it gives exploited creditors a way to speak out and be heard. So you see a lot of minority creditors who go there and say, wait. They discharged this guy and I got squeezed out, okay? And of course, when this tribunal comes up with a decision, what it has as power is to look at the books. And of course, you can say, don't look at my books, okay? But then people know you're not showing your books, okay? So it's kind of introducing as a sort of trial balloon, again, a mechanism that's purely reputation-based. But again, the protection of minority creditors is key in the popularity of this organization. To a large extent, I could almost stop there, but sadly, okay. Well, I guess certainly. The interesting turn is, so now they have a problem because they need to, if they move to becoming a formal voluntary association, that means that they will have created a kind of common law tribunal, okay, that will have some form of authority inside British common law, okay, so aside the Chancery, aside the King's Bench, and so on and so forth, you would have this kind of merchant court that somehow would be sanctioned and absorbed. And this is where actually the crucial evolution is going to take place, is that courts of justice are going to give a kind of silent nod to the London Stock Exchange. They're not going to say, yeah, do your stuff, it's kind of, we don't care. But they give a silent nod in the shape of an indirect claim. So what is happening is that there's the case of Morris versus Langdale. Morris is a lame duck, okay? And so as a result, and he has been uncooperative. And so he has been stigmatized and basically probably kicked out of the market. People have called him a lame duck and so on and so forth. And as a result of that, applying the recommendation of the tribunal, his creditors, okay, he's an uncooperative debtor, so his creditors have not paid him the debts owed to him. What they did is, as the tribunal suggests, they reached out to the creditor of Morris, and they paid directly their debts. Okay, what they owed to Morris, they paid that to the creditors of Morris, okay, over the head of the defaulter. So Morris' lawyer thinks he has a case. He goes to court and he says, okay, the tort is what? My client was insulted. He was called a lame duck. How do I measure damage? Well, he lost all those contracts that weren't paid to him, okay? And I think that's smart. They're going to use libel law to sort of crush this attempt at the jurisdiction. But the end of the story is that the judge is very smart or very insightful or whatever it is. And the judge said, well, I know how the stock exchange works. So you can go in the stock exchange and care about your reputation. Okay? And so they kill the lawsuit. There will be another trial, etc. And 3 weeks later, what happens is that the London Stock Exchange is incorporated as a voluntary association. Epilogue, I probably have 1 minute for an epilogue. For some reason, it's not. Oops, yeah, well, too much, overshot. Okay. Okay. So epilogue as a result, they organize themselves as a subscription room. The jurisdiction starts operating more than 20 years. They take decisions. There's a whole kind of interesting story of how they accumulate expertise about how you can discharge individuals. And so in the 1820s, when the first sovereign debt bubble takes place in the London Stock Exchange and crashes, they're going to essentially then import all that jurisdiction, making it for historians like me so difficult to understand what they're doing, unless you first look at the stockbrokers. Thank you very much. I guess one question.
Yes, Marc, congratulations on fascinating research, and it strikes me as eerily familiar. So would you have any advice to us on how to fix the common framework?
So that was the question. You saw how I navigated. I'm like, I don't know. No, I mean, like, what is really interesting is, so I think, for instance, this whole question of the coordination, it goes, and the importance of expectation of equitable treatment, for instance, is there. And of course, they're all once people say equitable treatment, and I think it raised parallel with modern comparability, no one knows exactly what that, okay, in practice, how you do that. But at the same time, I think it pulls through this kind of resolving basically the element of uncertainty that is intrinsic in any debt workout exercise, which is the sorting out of debt. So you need to have a place that is going to tell you, how do I render things comparable? It goes pretty far, pretty far. So that's in a companion piece I'm preparing. The creation of modern actuarial practice, okay, is a product of the leader of the London Stock Exchange, okay? So, of course, there's all kind of actuarial knowledge, there's allusion in Francois' paper and so on and so forth, but it was, for many reasons, there were various formula that were floating around. There was a problem about algorithm. I won't bother you with that. One of the first things that they do is that one of the major jobbers, market makers of the London Stock Exchange, who's tied to the jurisdiction, has this young mathematician joining him as partner, and they systematize actuarial knowledge to be able to come up with a common understanding of how formula are being used. Okay, and it continues that way to the point that if you open the Times in the the say 1860s, second page, people are literally discussing, oh, the restructuring of Ecuador would give you this, and no, would give you that. It's much better than this. And you're like, second page of the, you don't even find that on the website of the IMF, right? I mean, you have to buy panel to get that kind of information. And then when you run the numbers that they do, you're like, oh yeah, I know. If you apply the handbook, that's the formula that you get, okay? So what is really important is that it's the creation of a kind of space, but I think this is what all the efforts and lots of what I'm hearing is doing. That's why I don't have advice, I can, right? So just situating this into the long run history of those efforts. But the fact that you create a form of knowledge that is always about trying to create consensus about what is fairness. I think that's the lesson of this organization.
So we need a common framework.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Is it a point that's really debated?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. I thought it was debated but fixed too, right? No?
Thank you very much. It was brilliant. Is there any substantive evidence that the lender status led after to actually better practices? So in the period of study, does that lead to less restructuring situation, better practice, or it does not here because of the expeditive nature of this process? You're talking about weeks, right? So, it does not lead to a stigma, so it doesn't create better behavior on some of the data that there's an incentive as well of hiding the books like you mentioned. So
Yeah.
you find it substitute that the lenders that use input, and then you have actually better lending for each other and simulation.
So my answer is, I think it's yes. There's a difficulty to show that with systematic data because the material that we have does not document, for instance, the haircut, the time of the restructuring, etc., etc. What you have only is whether they discharge a person or not. We know because they're reference to call numbers that there were ledgers where they would do that, but those ledgers are lost. Okay, so there's a limit to how precise one can be. Now, we have case studies for which you can use other sort of papers and sort of get a sense. So you have some very interesting cases where the way I would think of it is that this mechanism and the tribunal format serves to produce a lot of information. So people learn a lot about effort, okay? So you have people who basically, with their books, they don't really look good, but they say, I don't care, I'll repay, maybe 20 years. You have cases where individuals toiled for 15, 20 years under the burden of that debt. There's a very famous, extremely wealthy individual at the end of his career, and his name is also famous for other reasons, Moses Montefiore, okay? So he went bust massively when he was 23. He was eventually fully discharged. I mean, he was discharged and then allowed to re-enter, and then he works on repaying his debts. He repays entirely his debt. That's his own choice, okay? And then what he does as he does that is he acquires enormous reputation. So my answer to is that even if there's solidarity and you can somehow work around, then you also become kind of a class B citizen or your class 1 citizen, depending on the effort that you're doing. Okay, and the stock exchange has also all kind of instruments. So for the very destitute, for instance, they create a fund. If you have a family, you really cannot pay, etc. They care for that. Okay, so you have very different patterns out of that. And what is interesting is that, of course, if you're aggressive, and I don't know how this translates to sovereign debt, but maybe it does. If you're aggressive enough to be proactive in the generosity of the terms you're extending, okay, then the incentive system of that arrangement is such that, in fact, people, for instance, direct clients to you. Okay, so your creditor is like, I want to pay me back, and so we become almost partner because we have this debt relation. Okay, so I think it points to the importance of any accompanying developmental framework if we make a sort of transpose to sovereign debt.
So we have a last question.
Okay.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. I wanted to know if there has been some contestation of this device, some creditors that were not satisfied at all with the functioning of this kind of resolution.
Okay, so in fact, that's the beauty of it. I spent a lot of time in the archive, and I mean, of course, you have people who are not, they're not satisfied with the outcome. For instance, there are a lot of complaints that kind of the pro-debtor bias that's built into that system is sort of pushed too far. Okay, so there are this kind of complaint. The interesting thing, though, is that you don't have a mean that is easy to dispute that mechanism. Okay, so the only way you have to dispute that mechanism is to kind of shift jurisdiction. And so that's something that will happen much later in the 19th century when you start having the rise of like really powerful competing markets, okay, that don't need to go by those rules and may press whatever is the enforcer there, can be a government, and typically that's the answer to sort of go grab the assets and so on and so forth. Because one thing that's characteristic of that is that this system really works without gunboat diplomacy. It's really enforced by the
without enforcement system.
Sorry.
Without an enforcement system.
So there is an enforcement system. Okay. So if we now move to the because the transplant to sovereign debt raises 30 seconds. The transplant to sovereign debt raises some difficulty. If it's stockbrokers, it's an association, so you can somehow grab them, kick them out, etc. If it's sovereign debt, you kick out a sovereign debtor. Okay. Now this is costly. Why? Because the stock exchange was willing to discharge you. And in fact, any other market is not going to be willing to discharge you. So for instance, you go to Paris and they can keep harassing you 50 years after the fact, okay? And we have cases. Portugal, for instance, continues to be annoyed for in the late 19th century for debts going back to the early 19th century. So in fact, London is giving you a lot of privileges in sort of, you know, protecting you in this fashion. So, but again, other governments may want to have their view on that. And if a government decides, for instance, to play the enforcer, I mean, when you have the beginning of the dollar diplomacy, for instance, right, when the US with the Roosevelt corollary signal that in fact they might be collecting British debt and force the full payment, then you see immediately the bondholders saying, I love the US, right? And they have, of course, no loyalty to the London Stock Exchange at that point, because they know that the system is going to give them higher recovery rates.
Thank you, Marc. We have a list, Pedro? Yeah.
Good morning, colleagues. Good afternoon. So we're presenting a paper on the road to Zambia's sovereign debt, 2020 sovereign debt report, and I'm sure most of us are familiar with. So my colleague Margret will do the first 5 minutes or so, then I'll do the next 5 minutes.
Okay, good afternoon. As Ignatius mentioned, we're presenting on this paper that we did in collaboration with FTL. So that's basically the outcome of the presentation. We're just going to look at the events that happened before Zambia defaulted in 2020 up to where we are now. Okay. So in 2020, Zambia made headlines for being the first African country to default in the COVID era on its Eurobond coupon payment of $42.9 million US dollars. So we saw a substantial reduction in Zambia's servicing debt because of its shrinking fiscal space, and consequently debt, it wasn't able to service its debt and only service half of that in 2020. So from that time, the country remained in default, and with significant reductions in external debt repayments, as well as accumulation of arrears. Consequently, we saw that the country sought for external assistance for it to retain its debt to sustainable levels and to help it go back to a sustainable fiscal path and obtain the much needed fiscal relief. So the study that was published is basically recounting some of the macroeconomic and fiscal events that led up to Zambia defaulting on its debt in 2020. So just to take you a little bit behind, so Zambia in 2011 was reclassified by the World Bank from a low income country to a lower middle income country. So in the early 2000s, we saw that the country benefited from the multilateral debt reduction initiative, as well as the heavily indebted poor country initiative, bringing the country's debt from about 7.1 billion to only around $500 million. And due to the fiscal space that it gained and the fiscal prudence that was enacted and all the measures that were taken to retain fiscal prudence, we saw that the country's macroeconomic landscape improved. We saw also a rise in copper prices on the commodity global market, as well as a boom in the mining industry. So this is where the country chief export earner is copper, and mainly it gets its products from the mining industry. And we saw a boom of that, leading to an increase in GDP growth rates that averaged around 6% over the period. So leading up to 2020, the country had a fairly stable and improved macroeconomic outlook, as well as a good macroeconomic landscape, where we saw a fairly stable exchange rate. We saw increased international reserves as a result of commodity price increases and increase in copper production. Due to that, we also saw single-digit inflation. This was relatively contained within the targeted bound with the central bank, and this culminated into increased GDP growth even further to 10% in 2010. And all these improvements in the macroeconomic landscape led to Zambia being reclassified in 2011 by the World Bank. So the graph on the right-hand side is just a depiction of some of the macroeconomic variables after the HIPIC and the MDRI initiatives that Zambia benefited from. So we see that in the period between before 2014, somewhere there, we see that Zambia was ranked as one of the fastest growing economies in sub-Saharan Africa, where there was a peak in our copper prices on the far right there. We see in blue there's but we see in blue there's we're talking about copper prices, and we see somewhere around 2011 where they peaked, as well as an increase in our copper earnings and a fairly stable exchange rate. On the left-hand side, we see that growth, although fluctuating, was relatively higher, with inflation rates relatively stable and declining average lending rates. And this culminated into current account surpluses that averaged around 3.5% of GDP, and improved reserves to over 3 months of import cover in the period that went as high as 4.7 months of import cover, with declining average lending rate. So beyond the reclassification after 2011, on the governance side of issues, we saw that there was a change in government in 2011 when they voted, and there was a new government that embarked on an expansionary fiscal policy. And this was inclined towards an infrastructure drive in the energy sector, in the transport, as well as information technology sector. So after being reclassified, at the same time, Zambia had access to international capital markets, where it could go and borrow commercially. Well, on the other hand, it had reduced access to concessional financing because of this reclassification. So after that, we saw also an increase in public administrative spending. Here, where we observed notable increases in salaries of civil servants that were increased of over 200,000 civil servants, establishments of new administration and new districts, as well as an increased subsidy program that was on the period 2011 to 2012. On the other hand, revenues only average around 17% of GDP, because most of the projects that were undertaken did not have significant economic gains to the economy, and revenues relatively average around 17%, while on the other hand, expenditure increased from 20% to about 23% of GDP over the same period. So as a result of this imbalance, lower revenues as opposed to high expenditures, Zambia recorded a consistent fiscal deficit, and the fiscal pattern increased on a cash basis from 2.8% of GDP in 2012 to about 5.2% in 2014. And unfortunately for the country, in 2015, we experienced a drought, and this led to reduced electricity for the economy, because Zambia is hydro dependent in terms of power. So that affected the electricity sector and ultimately affected industrial production in the mines. And because Zambia's chief export earner is copper, so we still also reduced revenues because of reduced production in the mine. So for the country to balance this, it resulted to increased imports as well as energy subsidies to cushion the effects of the drought. So this adverse macroeconomic environment led to reduced growth for the country, and we saw growth reducing in 2015 and 2016 respectively to 2.8%, 2.9%, sorry, and 3.4% in 2015 and 2016.
Okay, thanks, Margret, for taking us through the first part. So all those different elements of the economy contributed to the default and the performance of the economy. We saw that, the IMF indicated that Zambia was at high risk of debt distress in 2017 and repeated the same in 2019 with the country's credit ratings revised to CCC. What we also saw happening was that there was increased borrowing and interest rates payment, as you will see in the slides that are going to follow. Zambia's stock of public debts reached unsustainable levels clearly, and it became very difficult for the country to continue on that framework. And it happened at the point where there were a few challenges regarding debt management as well as construction. And the legislature that was in place then had a few loopholes here and there that made it very difficult to manage the country's debts. In 2020, with the onset of COVID, made everything worse. The country was hit with the first recession, the first one since 1998. So it grew at negative 2.8% in 2020. So even right before COVID, the macroeconomic environment was already in a bad state. And COVID just was the final nail on the country's issues. Okay, so what we see is that by 2020, the commercial debt, the black part, took up a substantial proportion of the country's debt. And it's the commercial debt that was a bit of a challenge on the government, on the government budget, because it was the one that was mostly very expensive to service. The rate of the increase in debt was much higher for Zambia than the average sub-Saharan Africa. So we saw that on average, comparing to other countries, Zambia's payment, interest payment and the debt itself was a lot higher. You see that external debt rose from about 5% in 2010 to about 65% in 2020 as a percentage of GDP. That's just external debt. For Zambia, debt to multilateral institutions as a share of external debt was declining. After the reclassification, we started borrowing quite a lot from other sources. These were the commercial lenders, and that made it very difficult. And because of the various challenges that we were facing and the inability to service our debt, especially after 2020, to the private creditors, we saw that the domestic debt profile increased quite substantially. The government bonds jumped quite substantially, as well as the treasury bills. The fiscal deficits kept widening, but our choices for funding were limited because we couldn't quite access commercial debt. And we saw that the domestic arrears also on the goods and services consumed by the government kept going up. Borrowing domestically meant that the government was crowding out private investors and also putting a strain on growth. Okay, so we see that perhaps maybe I'll focus on the red dots. We see that the red dots were going up, the debt service payment. As the share of budget between 2015 and 2021, we see that other sectors of the economy like education, health, as well as economic affairs were either declining as a percentage of GDP or remained relatively flat. But debt servicing costs kept going up as a percentage of GDP, crowding out other critical areas of the economy. So this was very, very concerning and became a lot worse in obviously 2019, 2020, as well as 2021. Okay. Okay, so here, well, I'm trying to, let's see. Okay, so the country had borrowed like 3 euro bonds, 2014, as well as 2015. So we see that in 2012, the euro bond was about 750 million US dollars. In 2015, it was about a billion. In 2014, about a billion. 2015, about 1.2 billion US dollars. Different maturities and all that. The Eurobond component was one of the most expensive components, or still is actually, the most expensive component of our commercial debt profile. This, however, also made it worse on the part of the government to service the debt. You see that in the report, when you look at the first Eurobond, there was a clear plan on what the government intended to use the proceeds for. But as we go to the third Eurobond, for example, you find that out of that about 1.2 billion, about 450 million was still not properly accounted for in terms of what was it that it was intended to be used for. What main lessons do we draw from the report? The main lessons are that from the borrowing country's point of view, there is need to exercise caution We understand that bonds are expensive sources of funding and require a clear and justified narrative for financial as well as economic return. But there's also a caution on the lenders, both bilateral and multilateral. They should also exercise more care, especially during transitions from low to middle income economies. So this generally is the road to Zambia's debt default. What we are cut, I think I'll skip this part. Director Masitala earlier on touched on this in terms of the timelines and where we are regarding the debt restructuring for the country. So in the interest of time, perhaps maybe I can just comment that it's been a protracted process from getting on the IMF program to forming the official creditors committee to getting an agreement with the official creditors committee to the holdouts in terms of other countries like China, getting into the room with representation from the bond holders, agreement in principle. So you can imagine this is from 2020 May up to 2024. This is a 4-year journey that we've been, and we still have about 25% of our debt to be fully restructured. So what we then intend to do now is to work on the second part of the report that will then focus on the defaulting, the negotiations, as well as the economic situations under default. So you realize that the analysis for the first report focused only up to the period of the default mostly. The second report will focus on what happened between 2020 to where we are in terms of the defaulting process, the negotiations, and the economic situation under the default. So I think in the interest of time, I'll end here and perhaps receive some comments and questions.
Very much. Thank you for a very insightful and useful case study of such an important example of debt restructuring, but giving us the backstory. And when you talk about lessons learned about using the Eurobond market, which is expensive, I wanted to ask if there's another lesson learned, for which I've talked to some students at the Harvard Kennedy School. Should Zambia have gone to the IMF earlier? Should the government officials gone in 2015 or 16 when copper prices went down, when the numbers weren't adding up, stop doing the next bond? So as a lesson to other countries, I know there's a lot of reluctance to going to the IMF, want outsiders telling what to do. Was there a policy decision made there that should have been made in retrospect to avoid the last couple of years when things got worse and worse and worse? You got deeper in the hole.
Yes, precisely. The country should have gone to the IMF much earlier. 2015 was a very bad year in terms of our macroeconomic stability. As my colleague mentioned, we had a major drought, and that drought affected the electricity generation. We had mostly hydropower in terms of electricity, so productivity went down. And because of that, at the same time, our agriculture is mostly rain-fed agriculture, meaning food production also suffered. We had to start importing both electricity as well as food. But copper, the mining also wasn't doing well at the time, and mining is our chief forest earner, earning about 75% of our forests. There was actually an attempt in 2016 to go to the IMF. The government had actually been quoting the IMF since 2016. We only managed to get on a program in 2022. Is it 2021, 2022? Yes. So there was an attempt. I think there was back and forth between the government and the IMF, but we couldn't honestly get on any program until 4 or 5 years later. So during that 5-year period, the situation deteriorated even further.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I would like to know, your conclusion was to be careful with bonds because they are expensive. Everybody knows that the bonds are expensive. In some countries, for instance, Uganda, they refrain from going to the market. Has there been any discussion in Zambia before borrowing from the market? Some public discussion or discussion among the Ministry of Finance?
Okay, so have there been any discussions? Of course, I think after the reclassification of the country from a low-income country to a lower middle income country, it sort of closed us off from concession or financing, which was the mode that we were very comfortable with initially. And I think the easier option there was the Eurobond. And when we, as a country, issued the first Eurobond, there was a lot of appetite for it. It was oversubscribed, if anything. So I think from the government point of view, they thought this is an easier way to get money and for developmental purposes. Like I mentioned, for the first Eurobond, there was actually a plan on how the proceeds should be utilized, right? But there were obviously issues in terms of the actual utilization of the resources. We realized that as we got the second Eurobond and the third Eurobond, the information was even more scanty on the usage of the Eurobond. And in some cases, by the time we're getting the third Eurobond, there's still about 400 million US dollars that is still not properly accounted for in terms of where it was meant to go in the economy and where it was actually used. So yes, I think other options should have been explored. Perhaps the inclination towards Eurobonds would have been that they were easier to get following the success of the first Eurobond. Otherwise, I think we should have looked elsewhere for other options and alternatives that should have been more affordable to service and finance.
Thank you.
Thanks for this excellent report. I have a question about the fiscal trajectory. In your view, what was it about the SATA administration in 2011 that made them decide to just spend no holds barred? Because there's a period before that when public finances were relatively well managed. And it's not the first time the copper prices went up or down in history, right? I mean, Zambia has some experience with that. So what was it about this period between 2011 and then when the copper prices started falling that really led to this spending?
Okay, so in 2011, two things happened. There was reclassification to the Zambian economy, to a lower middle income country, and like you rightly put it, there was a change in government. So we had a new president who had promised development in the form of infrastructure development, both energy, infrastructure and energy, road constructions, and whatever forms of infrastructure. Now, that happened at a point when we had limited resources in terms of where we could get the money from. And the fiscal deficit had only started widening. The fiscal deficit is widening, and we need to develop. The revenues suddenly are starting to go down, and they went out to borrow. The civil service we also went up at the same time, because when the government changed, there was massive recruitment in the civil service. So I think all these combined, the infrastructure drive in the midst of reducing revenue led to increased fiscal deficit year in, year out. And by 2015, the situation only got worse. Yeah, so I think it's on the political lines, what the new president wanted to offer, what he had promised. And when he got to office, he realized that perhaps we didn't have as much money as he could have needed to deliver on all those promises.
Very last question. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for the presentation and for the report. Very interesting. And I just want on your conclusion about being more careful on borrowing, but also on lending. On the first side, I understand that the Zambian government has also introduced some changes in oversight of public indebtedness. You could comment if you think that is the way forward. In the other side, is being more careful in the lending. That's a difficult one, and I was wondering if you also included or considered the impact of quantitative easing policies in the global north, making more money available and kind of more aggressive action from investors in looking for high revenues, particularly in African countries in general.
Okay, thank you so much. Yes, there have been changes in terms of how debt is now managed, especially now that the country is on an IMF-supported program. We see that some of those weak legislatures that we made reference to in the report have been worked on. So, for example, initially we had the Loans and Guarantees Authorization Act, which had, not so well, it was not consistent with the constitution of the country, right, in terms of debt contraction and management. So now we have the Public Debt Management Act, which is a better version of the construction and debt management, which is a good piece of legislation, which would help, obviously, the country ensure fiscal sustainability. For as long as there's implementation and whatever is contained in the Public Debt Management Act is followed, then that's a very good piece that can help us restore fiscal sustainability. I think there's also what the government is doing now. There's been a rein on non-priority spending in terms of projects. So the only projects that are being spent on are those that are deemed priority projects. There are a number of projects that were deemed not priority and have been cancelled in the recent past. There are also controls on procurement. Also, there were weaknesses on procurement, governance, and many other areas. What we also see is that lately the fiscal deficit has also been reducing. We are not experiencing the spending overruns that we would initially experience in terms of budget and actual spending. Those budget overruns, at least, are no longer the case. In terms of other sources, yes, I think the Global South can do more. The caution that we present here is really on the part of, when you lend, you expect a return. And it's not always the case that you will get a return when you need it. Like in this case, the debt is being restructured. The people that are losing out. On the Eurobond, to speak to the Eurobond holders, the actual quantum of money goes to Eurobond holders is about $3.8 billion. But 800 million of that has been written off. So that's a potential loss on the bond holders, or at least it's planned to be written off. So only the $3 billion, the face value itself, is what has been or will be restructured. So it's from that point of view. Then in terms of the global north, I think there are many ways in which they could obviously work with resource-rich countries like Zambia and provide relatively affordable financing. And obviously that will prevent countries like ours from going to expensive sources to get financing.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the session.